We ready? Okay. Hi. Thank you all for coming to tonight's discussion. My name is Jonathan Stein. I'm managing editor of Project Syndicate. We're a global news organization that syndicates commentaries, opinion pieces by world leaders, policymakers, academics to. You don't hear.
Sir, the microphone.
Am I mic'd?
Yeah, but this is mic for the camera. So
Sorry?
This is mic for the camera.
Yeah.
Just inside. So use this one.
Do you hear me now? I'm sorry. Okay. Do people, you hear me now? Okay. So again, I'll start over. Thank you for coming. My name is Jonathan Stein. I'm the managing editor of Project Syndicate. We syndicate commentaries, opinion pieces by world leaders, policymakers, academics to roughly 500 newspapers around the world. And I'd like to thank a couple of organizations who helped put this panel together. One is Polis, a student club here at the Philosophical Faculty, and the Embassy of Palestine for doing this. Now, unfortunately, according to the organizers, despite 6 months of effort, no voice from the other side of the debate was willing to participate. So when we move to the question and answer section, I will try to play devil's advocate and to ask some challenging questions of our participants. Our participants tonight are Yoni Mizrahi, who is the leader of an organization called Emek Shaveh, or Common Ground, which opposes the use of archaeological sites in Israel and the occupied territories for political purposes. Can I just ask that people put their phones in silent mode? I will do the same. Yoni will be talking about some of the events that are causing tensions in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. I can just say, as an American, some of you may have seen the recent news that the U.S. is withdrawing from UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, which plays a huge role in countries around the world preserving historical sites, including here in Prague. And one of the reasons was that the Trump administration has called UNESCO anti-Israel. And we'll hear a little bit more about that, I think. And then we'll turn it over to Ronnie Bar-Khan, who will set this conflict over archaeological sites into a broader context of Israel's nationalist drive to, in terms of sustaining and continuing and building on the occupation of the West Bank. And he'll describe some of the mechanisms of how that works. Ronnie is an organizer with a group called Boycott from Within, which is an Israeli organization that has made alliances with the global movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. So without further ado, we'll speak for a few minutes each, and I may ask some questions, and then we'll turn it over to you guys to ask questions as well. So, Yoni, please go first.
Thank you very much. May I use this mic as well? Yeah. Okay. So good evening to everybody, and thanks obviously to all the organizers that organized the event. I met few of you, Yana and others, and obviously the Palestinian Embassy, Mr. Ambassador, of course, and a few other people which I just met in the last 2 days or something like that. And thank you for coming, obviously. If you don't mind, I will stand and move to the other side for the presentation. This is why we did all these mic things. I'm standing, but like Jonathan just mentioned, I'm from Jerusalem originally, and general, but especially how the archaeology, how the historic monuments, how the historic narrative is part of the conflict. And in the end of the talk, I hope to reach to the situation, to talk a bit about what's happening in UNESCO or with UNESCO in general, what is the role that UNESCO is playing today in the conflict, which I think is very interesting and very unique to our conflict. I'll begin by introducing myself a bit, and Emek Shaveh, and then I'll talk a bit about Jerusalem 667 until today in general, based on my understanding and experience, and then I will try to explain what I understand happening around the historic and the religious monuments, which are very important, and then UNESCO. And in regards to terminology, we all have different terminologies, and I will try to cover all the terminologies I can. I can promise you it will not happen, because each one of us almost called the places different names, and you will see it obviously in my presentation. At least Jerusalem in English, everybody agrees it's called Jerusalem. The rest, I think, also UNESCO maybe. Okay. So Emek Shaveh is a small Israeli NGO that's challenging the use of archaeology as a political tool that was mentioned by Jonathan. And we began about 10 years ago by challenging the way, especially the Israeli Settlers Organization, working in East Jerusalem in order to create a situation that the historic monument, also again the religious monument as well, will be into control of the Israelis and will give legitimation to the whole settlement project, but also in many ways to exclude, according to my understanding, to exclude the Palestinians' rights from Jerusalem, from East Jerusalem. And today we're also witnessing to this kind of views in many places in the West Bank. I don't know if I'll have the time to talk about the West Bank. I'm going to focus in East Jerusalem, since at least it's a place that most of us at least heard about, if not familiar more than that. So the story begins, depends who you ask obviously, but this story today, this moment, began in Jerusalem borders after 1967. Immediately after the war of 1967, Israel focused first of all in changing the situation in Jerusalem. Now, until 1967, the border of Jerusalem was, like you can see with the green line. This is Jerusalem until 1967, okay? Which means West Jerusalem, what it says? This is West Jerusalem. And immediately after after War 67, Israel obviously occupied the whole West Bank, like we know, and Gaza Strip as well, but treated immediately a different approach to what's happening in Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank received a different attitude until today, I think. And the first thing was actually to annex the whole area that is marked in yellow, okay? Israel decided to annex all of these neighborhoods and villages, actually, something like 20 villages, which is very interesting when you're looking at the borders, because if you're familiar a bit with Jerusalem, so actually the border in the south is actually Bethlehem. If you're familiar with Bethlehem, the border is in Bethlehem, and Israeli knew that. If you look to the north, the border is actually in Ramallah. And Israel wanted the idea was actually maximum territories with minimum population. The agenda back then was to keep it in a situation that we will have 70% Jewish populations, 25% Palestinians, Muslims or Christians, doesn't matter, but in general, or Armenia, whatever. But we're talking about that's the percentage that Israel wanted to keep in order to present Jerusalem until today as the entire capital of Israel, obviously. But also I want to say that I think the minorities of having 25% Palestinians is important. It's not what is happening today, but the thinking here was actually to come and say, we're also keeping Jerusalem as a city which is open to other minorities, and also other minorities are living here. So that's my understanding how they wanted to make it in 1967. But like we all know, you plan something and it not always works. And Israel did all kind of, there's all kind of ways to keep the idea of having maximum Israelis and minimum Palestinians living in East Jerusalem. First of all, the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are not citizens of Israel. They're receiving a residency status, but they are not a citizen, and which means that in many ways their rights to live in Jerusalem is always challenged, could be challenged. For example, if you are Palestinian and you're living, I'm talking about Palestinians from Jerusalem, and you're living more than 7 years abroad, Jerusalem Interior Ministry allowed to take your residency rights. Something else which is interesting, although Israel annexed a lot of property like we saw before in the previous map, actually, maybe you can see it also in the other map over there, Israel never planned anything in there was no master plan for East Jerusalem, which means we're talking about 20 villages, dozens of neighborhoods, never organized any master plan, which means that if people would like to build for themselves, for their families, for other people, they face situation that they cannot receive a house permit, which means anytime the Israeli authorities allowed to demolish the house. I forgot to say something very important. Israel annexed, the whole area I'm talking about is Jerusalem, Israel annexed to Israel, and which means it has a totally different status than the rest of the West Bank. And I think that was the beginning of the struggle over Jerusalem, which I think until today is the main struggle, one of you, but according to my opinion, the main. You might hear there's other main struggles. And obviously, I mean, the fact on ground is that there is no master plan, and obviously the residents of East Jerusalem are no citizens, but also they are facing a lot of tough bureaucracy, which begins in childhood, if you like to register your name, your kids, and so on. So Israel definitely trying to do whatever they can to keep what they thought would be 75-25, if you remember what I said before. In 2004-2005, Israel built the separation wall from different reasons, but actually it's helped, from the Israeli point of view, to create kind of a barrier between the West Bank and Jerusalem. And it's definitely changed dramatically the transformation of population in East Jerusalem. So there was a plan, there was all kind of means, but eventually the result is that this plan, from the Israeli point of view, failed. Because today, we're talking about 40% Palestinians and 60% Israelis, which is not the numbers that Israel wished for in 67 or during the war. We're talking about population of like 350,000, maybe less, maybe. It's not important now the number, I might say 3,300, doesn't matter. It's around 300,000, that was important, more than 300,000. And that way it did and what is very interesting is that although Israel tried to come and say this is the united capital of Israel and we welcoming more or less the Palestinians to live with us, we definitely see until today a strong resistance of the Palestinians by coming and saying, again, that's my personal opinion, as someone who lives in Jerusalem and see what's happening, but obviously it's eventually an opinion. I definitely feel that there is kind of a strong resistance when it's come to Jerusalem. I will dare to say that the Palestinian resistance to a change in Jerusalem sometimes is even stronger than Palestinian resistance in other places in the West Bank, and again, that's my personal opinion. And Israel didn't succeed to change the identity, the idea that if we call it Jerusalem or Urshalim el-Quds, you know, the idea was to call it Urshalim, like in Arabic. Eventually, the Palestinians don't keep this name. And that's the situation until today. But the policy didn't change. We must think and remember that from the Israeli point of view, a change in Jerusalem is crucial. That's how I understand it. It's crucial to remain Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And I think that what's happening in the last decade, which is very interesting and that is more relevant to what we are involved, is what's happening in the area which we are calling the historic basin of Jerusalem, or the Holy Basin of Jerusalem. It's a Christian name, Holy Basin, but we will stick with it. Christianity brought all kinds of names to this place. And if this is the green line, okay, you can also identify the green line because it's in green. We have the old city here. The Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif is here. The village of Silwan is very interesting, and I intend to talk about it. By the way, you can see also in the maps of the demolition houses that Silwan is one of the highest numbers, which is very interesting. And when we are talking about the historic area of Jerusalem, it's obviously the old city, and the area around the old city, like especially Silwan, where we have the ruins of ancient Jerusalem from its beginning, from the Canaanite city, and later on to the Judean and so on. Oops, and something happened, and I hope it will come back. Yes, it did. And I want to say, and I'll try to convince you, that one of the main struggles that are taking place today in Jerusalem is around the narrative, the monuments, and control of the history. Now, according to the international law, according to what all the countries agree, including Czech Republic and Trump administration until today, that East Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem that you can see, and all of the rest of what you see is an occupied land. There's only one state who disagrees to this statement. What I'm talking about is Jerusalem. You might be heard about it, obviously Israel, where I'm coming from, obviously. The rest of the world is actually considered as an occupied land. Now, Israel would like to change that. And like I said a few times in this talk, I think this is the main struggle. So when it's come to population, Israel failed, because the majority of the people who live in East Jerusalem are Palestinians. Israel didn't succeed to change demographic numbers. So now we are facing something else, which is interesting. We're facing the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, obviously, the most known one, the Western Wall. Again, I'm using terminology as in Israel. Archaeological monuments from Judean Kingdom, from the Second Temple period, all kinds of churches, the many churches, the Holy Sepulchre is one of them, and hundreds of Muslim monuments. I mentioned a few, but actually when you think about it, also the wall of the old city is actually Ottoman. So one of the main symbols of Jerusalem is Ottoman. If you think about the symbol of, those of you who are a bit familiar with Jerusalem, if you're thinking about David Tower, it actually was built by the Mamluks or the Ottomans. I'm not remembering, but some of the main symbols actually of Jerusalem were built during the Muslim period. And eventually, and we're also having a situation with many churches, that most of the churches that we see today in the old city, they are from the 19th century, okay? I mean, there are ruins before, but most of the structures that we see today. So, historically, it's very complicated, very complex, and if you look at the monuments, you can come and say it's holy to Jews, Muslims, Christians, which makes sense. So obviously, if you think about it, how can we make it that only one side will come and claim ownership? And what Israel did immediately after 67 again is actually created a few changes that changed the landscape of the old city. And the first thing is actually immediately after the war of 67 is to demolish the neighborhood here. This neighborhood, which is called the Mukabi neighborhood, is located in the map here, where the Western Wall Plaza is today. And the first act that Israel did at the 10th or the 11th of June, and I'm mentioning that because that's the last day of the war, is to demolish the whole neighborhood and create the plaza. And why it's important? Because for all the Israelis and all the people who are coming today to Jerusalem, when they see the Western Wall, they consider it the way it looks today. which means the change on the ground succeeded to create a lot of change in the people's mind. And also it's considered, obviously, today it's considered not the most holy place to Judaism, but the second holy place to Judaism, but definitely the most popular site for Jewish praying and also national events. So that was the first change. The second interesting change was in the Jewish quarter, which is here, which the plan was to evacuate the population from the Jewish quarter, demolish half of it, not half by 50%, but part of it. Large excavations took place and inhabited the Jewish quarter with Israelis. And in that respect, Israel succeeded to change part of the character of the old city, but not all the character of the old city. And today, if you are walking in the Muslim quarter or Christian quarter, you definitely feel the old city, like the Palestinian city, if you want to call it. But when you're walking in the Jewish quarter, you feel the Israeli city. And that's something that Israel did by then. And since then, they are trying to continue this kind of struggle, but it's obviously a bit stuck because people are living in the Muslim quarter and in other places, and Israel never succeeded to change that. Now, what is interesting today, something that Israel is doing quite a lot, is actually in underground excavations, especially under the Muslim quarter. And this tunnels excavation, which I just brought two maps, I hope you see the map, the places quite well. I think they're very interesting because I would like to say something about the narrative. I hope I still have time. I don't know how much time I have.
Let's say another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, so 1 minute for narrative and 4 for UNESCO. Immediately after 1967, Israel began to excavate tunnels, especially under the Muslim quarter. Today there are many tunnels also under Silwan village that, based on the time I have, I'm not going to talk about Silwan, but they're also an interesting place by itself. You can look at in our reports in general. And the tunnel is actually an excavation that's taking place underground that you are not familiar. If you're walking underground, you're not familiar, you're not observing what is happening around you at the upstairs, so you're kind of having a trail that is planned, that you feel the past, okay? You are exploring the history. And this history is very interesting. Why it's very interesting? Because if you ask me what do we see? So according to Israeli archaeologists, this path that you're seeing here, I hope that you see over there, I see you here, the path that you're seeing here is actually dated to the early Islamic period. According to archaeologists, he believes that it's from the Abbasic period, which is the 8th century. Some scholars believe it's earlier or later. I find that it makes sense that it might be Fatimid, not Fatimid, but might be even Ayyubid corridor whatsoever. But the whole experience as a guide, as a tourist, when you're walking in the tunnels, is mentioning the Israeli narrative or the Jewish narrative. That the Israeli people lived here 2,000 years ago, the Israeli people lived here, and there was a temple 2,000 years ago, and this is the main narrative. That I'm personally, that's very important to say in this platform, I'm personally definitely believe that the temple was where the Haram is today. And I definitely believe that Jewish people lived in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. But what is interesting is this narrative, that this is the only narrative that people are hearing with all kinds of other things. So you can explore Jerusalem from the Israeli point of view without being familiar with, let's say, the non-Israeli Jerusalem, if you want to call it. What is rest, which is actually quite a lot. And that actually helps to create a narrative. And first of all, this narrative is very much dominant among the Israelis. That when we talk about Jerusalem, we talk about Jerusalem that belongs to the Israelis. Unfortunately, most of the Israelis don't see the complicity of the history of Jerusalem. Okay? And this is when the Israeli government come and talk about Jerusalem Jewish identity. It's something that corresponds in many ways with the Israeli public. Now, I'm going to jump and not talk about Silwan, which is interesting, fascinating, and tragic case of struggle of the settlers against of a village. I will just say that in one thing that Silwan in general is a case that the settlers succeeded to create, I think, a new identity to a Palestinian village by using the archaeology of the archaeological site of City of David. And today, it's not by chance that the numbers of demolition in Silwan are so high, because Silwan is one of the main tense areas where Israel would like to create a change. Now, I'm going to jump, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry about that. And now, I just want to say something about what I said so far. A lot of it is about my opinions, but we do have numbers and facts that in 2005, there is a clear Israeli governmental policy to invest hundreds of millions of euros, if you want, or shekels, or corona. In corona, it could be billions, actually, in the historic monuments of Jerusalem, okay? In order to create the feeling that Jerusalem belongs to us. And what happened in the struggle of Jerusalem, we're all familiar, or we're supposed to be familiar, with Palestine becoming a member state in 2011 in UNESCO. But the struggle over Jerusalem in UNESCO, according to my understanding, began before. In 1981, Jordan asked to nominate Jerusalem as a World Heritage Site, and in 1982, Jerusalem was considered a World Heritage Site under danger. Now, since Palestine became a member in UNESCO, Palestine obviously has the right to come to UNESCO with a list, what we are calling the tentative list of our archaeological site or historic site or whatsoever, other site as well, and ask the committee, the UNESCO committee, I make it short, to accept, it's state members that have to accept the idea that some of the sites are a World Heritage Site. Also Israel do that, and also Czech Republic do that, and even the great America of Donald Trump used to do that. What would be now, I don't know, but who needs UNESCO? We know what is good for America. Anyway, so if we're following the international law and the diplomatic arena in UNESCO, UNESCO must consider the West Bank as occupied land because it's a UN body. Which means if Palestine is a member state, everything which takes place in the West Bank should be considered or dialogue or managed with the Palestinians. And this is why the Palestinians have the full right to submit sites to UNESCO, like they did with Hebron, Khalil, less than a year ago, right? It was in May, right? In May, last May. Last May, yes. This May, 6 months ago. Now, also something very relevant that happened in UNESCO, since Jerusalem is a World Heritage Site, under danger, UNESCO obliged to monitor the changes in the historic city. For example, I know I'm out of my time, I'm sorry for that, but, sorry. For example, if tomorrow the Czech municipality, or the prime municipality of the Czech Republic will decide to remove Charles Bridge, I don't know, to make a train, okay? They will be criticized, hopefully that the bridge is part of UNESCO, I don't know, part of UNESCO World Heritage Site, considering it is. They will be criticized by UNESCO itself, since it's a World Heritage Site. It doesn't mean you cannot do whatever you want. but power talks eventually, but definitely you'll be criticized by UNESCO. And by the way, next to us there is a city called Dresden in Germany. It used to be a World Heritage Site, and after a while it was removed from the list. So UNESCO comes and says, if Israel doing in the old city all kind of activities, excavating tunnels, building all kind of buildings, changing the historic city in a way that it's not preserve it as it should be, we obliged to criticize Israel. And this is where I think that UNESCO role, according to my understanding, is crucial and important and probably will continue. It doesn't matter if Israel will withdraw from UNESCO or not. By the way, I don't think it will. I don't know if you know, but America is a bit stronger than UNESCO, and America can do many things that Israel cannot do. And eventually, Israel is always blaming UNESCO. How dare you telling us to do whatever we want in our Jerusalem, although Israel is always changing the situation in the historic basin, also from archaeological point of view. This is why we have this kind of endless struggle. I just want to say, really the last sentence. Eventually, from my point of view, I believe the political solution should begin in Jerusalem. I believe that only situation that we can understand the complicity of the narrative of Jerusalem, the complicity of the feeling that all the religions have, not all the religions, all the monotheistic religions have to Jerusalem, and even the feeling, by the way, you don't have to be a religious person to have a feeling to Jerusalem. Until we understand how complicated Jerusalem is, and we'll understand that the extremists, from my side, today is the Israeli extremists, cannot do whatever they want in Jerusalem, until then we will not reach to a solution. And I think that unfortunately today, in the front of the struggle in Israel is actually the main Israeli extremist groups who are changing more and more the situation in Jerusalem, which I think is definitely very dangerous. Thank you. This is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yoni. Now we'll hear from Ronnie Barkan to place this in the context of the broader struggle between Israel and Palestine over sovereignty, really.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Ronnie. I'm an Israeli activist. As was mentioned, a member of the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign against Israel, also a conscientious objector to military service. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the organizers. Unfortunately, there was no response from, let's say, the adversaries, the other side. They chose not to participate. But we have heard that the Israeli embassy did communicate with the organizers trying to cancel this event. So I would argue that they probably do participate in the only way that they can, which is trying to silence the discussion about the facts and trying to silence the discussion about justice and truth and equality in Palestine.
If I can just interrupt you for a second, I'd like to follow up to that point that, you know, again, in my native country, the U.S., I think there is now something like 22 states that are considering criminal sanctions against anybody who supports BDS. There have been proposals for federal legislation to make support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions a felony. Now, this is really quite shocking, given the U.S. tradition of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And I'm not sure that whether any of these proposals will withstand scrutiny, by the U.S. courts. But it does reinforce what you're saying, that it seems as though rather than participating in these kinds of discussions and dialogues, the Israeli government is really quite determined to try to shut them down, even if that reinforces the narrative that Israel is an undemocratic state. I'm sorry.
Yes, no, thank you very much for the interjection. This is very important. And we're seeing this happening all over the world. Basically, Israel is using the only tool that it has in its arsenal, which is forcing people, basically using force and more force, bullying people into either being silent about this issue or simply censoring the discussion altogether. So this is done via legislation and done via other means of sheer bullying, and there is proof for that. I titled this talk, Occupy Jerusalem, a Microcosm of Israeli Apartheid. Jerusalem is a microcosm in itself. It is sort of a world within a world. Everything that happens in Palestine, everything about the Zionist-Palestinian conflict also happens in that microcosm of Jerusalem. The way it came about to this point in time, which was what I would like to talk about, and also some thoughts about the future. Everything that will happen in Jerusalem will probably also whatever will be determined about the future of Jerusalem will also probably determine the future of Israel-Palestine. Every slide here, and I had to be very selective about the slides, is again a world in itself. We can talk about each and every slide for hours. I wanted to start here, and Yoni started in a different starting point, and this is fine. This is why we're here. Two people expressing somewhat different narratives. I wanted to start here showing basically the Zionist project in Palestine in the sense of how it evolved since 48 or a little before 48 to this day. Even this map is not complete. This is only about the control of the land. There are other aspects to be discussed that do not appear here, like, for example, who are the people living on that land? What is the demographic consistency of that land? Okay, so in this map, the left map is from 1946. It shows us the division between Jewish and Palestinian-owned land in Palestine. What happened, there were, after World War II, after the Holocaust, basically the situation was that there was the Zionist project in Palestine tried to bring in as many, mostly European Jews over there, and at most there were about 30% of the population there were Jewish, and they owned about less than 10% of the land. So what happened later, what is regarded as the partition plan of the UN, that partition plan gave the white area, the second map, the white area was given which is 56% of the land, was given to those who were about 1/3 of the population, and they only had 10% of the land in their possession. So that map, giving more than half of the land to less than half of the population, was clearly an unfair decision, especially taking into account that most of the people, those Jews who were supposed to inherit that land, were newcomers to the land. Most of them were colonizers who came in for these very purposes, to take away the land. But that map, that plan never came into being. It only exists on paper. Because the very next thing that happened is that during the war of 1948, the Zionists who founded the state of Israel insisted to have what they call a Jewish and democratic state. Now, Jewish and democratic state is not a logical term. Either you have a democracy or you don't have a democracy. Either you have equality or you don't have equality. But what it meant for them was that if they control the population, if they become the majority in that land, then they can claim that they are a democracy. They can play somewhat of a democratic game in that land. That thinking was implemented by driving away the indigenous people from their land, Over 530 villages have been demolished. Over 700,000 Palestinians have been expelled from their land. To this day, there are refugees. The refugee community, the Palestinian refugee community, is about 70% of all Palestinians. So this is a very serious issue. And they are refugees to this day. That version of having this Jewish majority, which was created by force, carried on until the occupation of 1967. So you have the situation in the third map, the white area for Israel, the green area under different rule, and then in 1967 the rest was occupied. The Gaza Strip on the west and the West Bank on the east, including East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is part of the West Bank. However, sorry, just a second. Okay, East Jerusalem and the West Bank were occupied in 1967. However, as Yoni mentioned, Israel treated the issue of East Jerusalem very differently. They did not place them under military rule. They have annexed the territory, and later on in 1980, that part became part of Greater Jerusalem for every intended purpose, and was very much opposed to by the international community. There is a decision by the Security Council in 1980 saying that Israeli expansion, Israeli changing of the situation in East Jerusalem is illegal, basically, and this is agreed upon by every state other than Israel. Moving forward, or since 1967 to this day, we have the situation as can be seen here. On the left side, I have a quote from a recently published UN report about the question of apartheid in Israel. And that report clearly states that Israel practices the crime of apartheid, and that crime of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity under international law, is applied to all 4 domains of Palestinian society. Which are these 4 domains? Those who are Israeli citizens, but are basically second-class citizens. They are the ones here. Then the East Jerusalemites, who are under a different category. Those who are under military occupation, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And finally, the refugees, who are in diaspora. Now, if we zoom in a little, the case of Israeli apartheid, unlike the previous case of apartheid in South Africa, is not as black and white. In South Africa, there was a very clear case of the privileged and the underprivileged. The Israeli version of apartheid is a much more sophisticated form, which is much more layered. At the top, we have privileged Israeli Jews like Yonatan and myself, and we can live in most of the territory. We have voting rights, and the whole legal system is built in such a way that it will give preferential treatment to people like ourselves. Then there are those who are Israeli citizens, but they are not among the privileged group. While we all have Israeli citizenship, we don't all share the same nationality. We would have Jewish nationality written in our identity card, while those who are second-class citizens will have another type of nationality. And this is how Israel differentiates by law between its own citizens. Today, there are more than 50 laws that discriminate between those who are privileged and those who are underprivileged inside Israel proper, or what we call Palestine 48. Then we have this small group in the middle, which are the East Jerusalemites. Those who have been annexed, and they are not citizens, and they cannot vote for the parliament, but they have relatively more freedom than those who are under military occupation. Their situation is kind of a quasi situation, and they live in a very precarious state of affairs. Yonatan mentioned, for example, that any East Jerusalemite who comes to study here in Prague and they do not go back home for several years, you said 7 years, they could lose the right to ever go back home, even though it is very likely that their family has been living there for generations, possibly long before the State of Israel was founded. Likewise, any East Jerusalemite who marries someone in the West Bank, as I said, East Jerusalem and West Bank are the same territory, only that Israel treats it differently. Anyone who marries someone in the West Bank and they go and live there, and they don't go, as often enough to East Jerusalem, they can lose the right to ever go back home. They can possibly see their house from Ramallah, but they cannot go there. And then we have those under military occupation in the green areas, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and finally the refugees. I mentioned, this is an example, that I have an Israeli citizenship, but I don't have an Israeli nationality. This is done for a reason. My nationality is Jewish because the legal situation is such, the whole legal system is built in such a way to discriminate between those who have Jewish nationality and those who don't. Now, what about those who live under that situation? Those Israeli citizens who I called second-class citizens. Here is one example of many. Not only that the laws are discriminatory, what happens to those who run for parliament in Israel, the Israeli Knesset? So, basic law of the Knesset says very clearly that a candidates list cannot participate in elections to the Knesset, and a person shall not be a candidate for election to the Knesset if it objects, if the objects or actions of the list or the actions of the person expressly or by implication include one of the following, and the first thing is negation of the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Basically, any party that demands equality in Israel, any party that runs for elections and denies Israel inherent supremacist character cannot run for elections. It will be disqualified from elections. There is also an amendment to that law saying that also any candidate who expresses themselves, not only the party platform, but any candidate who expresses themselves even on Facebook for that matter, against that supremacist character of the state will not be able to run for elections. So that same UN report that I mentioned before that squarely blames Israel for practicing the crime of apartheid equates that situation to basically they say it is like giving voting rights to, the analogy would be a system in which slaves have the right to vote, but not against slavery. And this is pretty much the situation. These are the ones who do have voting rights. Now we go to the East Jerusalemites, who do not have voting rights to the parliament. This is the situation in East Jerusalem. I don't know if this is visible enough, but this infographic shows very clearly the situation of the discrimination that exists. And then there are many layers of discrimination. But just as an example, Yoni mentioned that there is a policy of controlling the demographics in that city. The initial policy was to control a situation of 70% versus 30%, 70% Jews, 30% non-Jews. Later on, the population increased, the Palestinian population increased, so the more recent policy, a paper called the Jerusalem 2020 plan, states that they have to maintain a cap of no more than 40% Palestinians in the city, 40% versus 60% Jews. Just imagine any other city that clearly states that we have to make sure that we don't have more than an X percentage of Jews living in the city. Just imagine the reaction in the world to such a statement. And this is official municipal policy. The municipal policy is far worse than that, because they take every measure in order to separate communities. Part of that same plan, the Jerusalem 2020, is also about making sure that there is spatial difference. I mean, the neighborhoods will be built in such a way, or there will be a clear division between the Jews and the non-Jews. And there are many, many more elements that are taking place. So just a few of those elements are, when we look at the budget, okay, how much of the city budget was allocated? So 93% was allocated to the Jewish population, 7% to the Palestinian taxpayers, even though the percentage is 60-40. When we talk about the land that's being zoned, annexed, and so on, basically in East Jerusalem, 87% of the land was allocated for zoning for the Jewish population, 13% for the Palestinian construction, and finally about the permits, building permits that Yoni mentioned, that it is very difficult to even achieve a building permit because there is no master plan, and it is very easy to disqualify any attempt to build, any appeal to receive a building permit. Then 93% of the permits were given to Jews, 7% to the Palestinians. Among those with building permits violations, these are the number of violations. In West Jerusalem, there were almost 80% building violations, out of which 27% ended up in demolition orders, while probably the mirror image exists in East Jerusalem. 21% building violations, while 84% of them arrived at the situation of demolition orders. The situation is again far worse. Those who receive demolition orders and have their homes demolished, other than the traumatic psychological aspect of that, they also have to pay to the municipality to have their houses demolished. And it is said that, for example, over the period of 6 years, 2001 to 2006, Israel made over 25 million shekels just with receiving these fees for demolition orders for people paying to demolish their own homes. Some people claim, how long do we have roughly? Yeah. Okay.
Well, how much do you have? How much more do you have?
About 10 minutes?
I think 10 minutes is
okay.
Okay. About right.
Some people claim that the situation in Israel, in Jerusalem revolves around religion. And I would like to go back to the times before the Zionist Project was founded. This is a quote from Rabbi Dushinsky and Rabbi Benis, who gave their testimony to the UN Special Committee in Palestine in '47 on the issue of Jerusalem. And this was at a stage where they already conceded to the fact that there will be a Zionist state in Palestine. They were very much opposed to that. These rabbis, they were the chief rabbis of the Ashkenazi community there, and they represented 60,000 religious Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, all of which were staunch anti-Zionists. They did not want to have a Zionist state in Palestine. Earlier on, they tried to work against the Balfour Declaration. They tried to make sure that there will not be a Zionist state established. Eventually, when they conceded to the fact that there will be a state, they approached the committee, the UN committee, asking, please leave Jerusalem out of it. Please leave Jerusalem as an international city. And what they say is, just a short quote, is that Orthodox Jewry has not the slightest intention of subjugating any section of the population of the Holy Land. We merely demand that the gates of Palestine be opened to all those Jews who have no home and enable them to live their lives in accordance with the commandments of the Lord. This may not be representative of all Jews, of course, but this was the sentiment of those ultra-Orthodox Jews who were living in that city. Unfortunately, the UN did not heed their call. at the same time, what we have in current days is someone like Chaim Lamon, who is the former deputy prime minister. He's regarded as a leftist and so on. You can see him giving a speech here at J Street, a liberal Zionist organization. And he's very concerned about the fact that very soon the Palestinian population in Jerusalem will become a majority. I mentioned that East Jerusalemites cannot vote for elections for the Israeli parliament. They can, however, as Jerusalemite residents, vote for municipal elections. Those liberal Zionists are very concerned about the fact that very soon those Palestinians living in Jerusalem will become a majority. Already we have a 60-40 state of affairs. What will happen next? So this is quite recent. This is from last year. Chaim Lamon says that, warns about the fact that the next mayor of Jerusalem might be the Mufti's grandson. And he refers to the Palestinian neighborhoods of Jerusalem as a malignant tumor in the city. He is also heading an organization or an initiative called Saving Jewish Jerusalem, which is all about that. They are trying their best to separate the Palestinian neighborhoods of Jerusalem from the greater Jerusalem for demographic reasons. Because of, if you remember the previous maps that we saw about creating a Jewish majority by force, about creating this Jewish and democratic state, once Israel annexed Jerusalem, there was a problem. They also annexed the people of Jerusalem along with the land, just like with the West Bank. Now what are they going to do about it? This is the main question, probably the only question that exists among the different Zionists, the so-called left in Israel versus the right. What do we do about those Palestinians that are regarded as some sort of a problem? We want the land, we don't want the people, what do we do about it? Okay? The right-wing version is to say this land is ours and only ours. If we control, if we dictate, we are willing to have the others as, say, second-class citizens. If they are willing to be subjugated, we are willing to have them. If not, they can find another place. The left wing in Israel is speaking a different language. They would like to refer to themselves as liberal Zionists. They would like to refer themselves as, those who believe in democratic values, and therefore, their version is we cannot clearly, explicitly say that we want to dominate over another population. So their version is we need to make sure that they are not part of our land. We need to create again, just like happened in 1948, we need to create our Jewish majority by any means necessary. If we have too many Palestinians in the city, we will have to drive them out of the city. We'll have to carve out a piece of the city. If there are too many Palestinians that we are currently occupying in the West Bank, we will have to carve out these territories where there are too many Palestinians. This is part of what the two-state solution is about. These are two examples that we don't have time for the moment, two videos demonstrating what I just said. Okay, and I will end. Okay, and I will end with Chaim Lamon here. We have to remember that the thinking behind the control of Jerusalem is about demographic, is about making sure that the majority of the population is Jewish, making sure that those who are in control, they are the ones who dictate. And then, basically what Israel is doing is it uses all kinds of different tools in its possession. In Jerusalem, you have all the different elements of the system working in tandem. There is the municipality that has different plans, Plan Jerusalem 2020, Jerusalem 2050, the Maron plan, which is all about the looking forward about zoning and urban planning and so on. There is the police, which is basically enforcing, a regime of harsh control over the population. There is the Shin Bet, the Security Service, that is handing blacklists to the municipality about different political activists in the city, and that municipality is giving fines to those activists. So all of these elements are working together. And finally, as was mentioned, especially this is the case in the places that Israel would like to annex and drive away the population from, like those areas around the Holy Basin. And they are using different practices in order to drive away the population from there. Basically, we can end with, I don't know if you can hear that, we can end with Chaim Ramon basically speaking about what will be the case if Palestinians basically, do not want to separate.
This is a major trend now among Palestinians. They will come to the capital. Maybe Case Week, when they celebrate 10 years from now, decade.
Can you hear that? No, it's different.
And they will say very simply, we want to live together with Israel, not side by side.
Okay, we will leave that for later. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Ronnie. So now I'd like to open it up to some questions, and I think I'll just start with one for Yoni, which is sort of more on the narrow question of control of archaeological sites. And I really am not an expert on this at all, but I do know that the Temple Mount area, Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are under a Jordanian trust. Now, is that a kind of model that could be extended? Could it be used for other sites? Not necessarily a Jordanian trust controlling it, but some outside party removed from both Palestinians and Israelis or Zionists. Is that a possible solution?
Well, may I?
Yeah.
I think that a possible solution, which maybe your idea with, I mean, it's true that Jordanian has kind of a trust over the Haram Sharif in general and the mosque, but also in the Waqf. I think that, and also if you were looking at the plan of the UN back then, there was kind of an idea that Jerusalem, at least the historic city of Jerusalem, will have like a kind of an international sovereignty or something like that. And I think that when it comes, and that's my opinion, but very much I think I am presenting the opinions of even the organization I'm part of, which we have many opinions which are different. In regards to that, actually, we do agree that the best solution would be kind of a situation that international committee or different players will be involved in the way the historic monument and the religious monuments will be preserved. And not necessarily only Israelis or Palestinians. And I think it's not necessarily regards to the sovereignty. Like it could be like Palestinian sovereignty over the Muslim quarter or Silwan village, which I wanted to talk, but the question is how the archaeological site or the historic site will be managed, and that could be kind of maybe custodian of an international body or something like that. But I like to say that this is, in many ways, it's a good solution. If it works, it's definitely a solution, because based on what I understand, eventually Jerusalem is a place that, if we like it or not, brings all the extremists together. I mean, that's, and even, by the way, I truly believe that Israel government, definitely in the 70s, didn't want Jerusalem, old city, to be controlled mostly by the extremists. By the way, if you look at the history of the Jewish quarter, the idea was actually to have kind of a pluralistic neighborhood. eventually the most, today if you look at the Jewish quarter, it's very nationalistic quarter. So the only way I understand, one of the ways to decline the power of the extremists is actually this kind of suggestion that the historic monuments will be in kind of management. But I think what is needed, that's about the level of the management, but I think what is needed is, from my point of view as an Israeli, is the Israeli people to understand that the history and the historic monument and the religious monument of Jerusalem are not exclusively or not more belongs to them than they belong to the other, and sometimes actually belong to the other much more. I mean, and that's something that is needed, because I think that it's not just about political solution, like, okay, we got it, and okay, this is the agreement, Jordan or someone else. It's about, I strongly believe that a sustainable agreement needs a situation that the majority of both sides are not about thinking how to violate this kind of an agreement. And that's something that is needed in the public's opinion.
Okay, and I'll just ask one for Ronnie as well. You're an activist with Boycott from Within, which the BDS movement challenges this national narrative of Israel. The Zionist narrative with sort of Jewish supremacy within the land. How do you boycott from within? What does that look like? How does that work?
So the name is a little misleading, because it's not about, the full name is actually Boycott Supporting the Palestinian Cause, the Palestinian BDS Call from Within. So Boycott from Within is just a catchy phrase that caught on, but basically it is not about Israeli Jews dictating to Palestinians, but rather being those among the privileged who support the underprivileged in their just struggle and fully and wholly endorse the Palestinian call for BDS.
Okay, let's open it up to questions from you guys. Anybody?
No, yes, sir, with you. So how do you want to proceed? Just like one by one, or you want to collectively?
Yeah, one by one. I mean, if somebody just hand the mic to somebody, but I don't see anybody asking with a question. There we go. Finally, break the ice. Thank you.
It's on. Thank you. My name is Yana. I would like to ask maybe Jonathan, Yoni, about the successes of the Temple Movement, Temple Institute, and their aims, and about the legitimacy of worries of the Palestinians, of this influence of this organization.
Okay, thanks. I mean, there are different movements, what we are calling the Third Temple movement. There are different groups. Eventually, the agenda is to change the status quo in the Temple on Haram al-Sharif. And in the last decade, we definitely see increasing in the numbers of the Jewish Israelis going up to the Haram, to the Temple. And we see, what is more important than that, we see that these groups are getting much more support from Israeli politicians. And that's something that's important to understand, because I still believe that if you would ask 90% of the Israelis what they think about Third Temple movement and things like that, they will tell you that they are more concerned about the coffee they are drinking in the morning, if it's hot enough or not. But this kind of a small group that's increasing actually has a lot of power, because they have all kind of Knesset members and ministers. And in many ways, I think that Netanyahu is actually listening to him, the prime minister. And they're succeeding to create a change in the status quo all the time. But this is a very small change, which is very difficult to explain. I mean, we had a report that shows that actually since '67 until today, I believe Israel, with this movement and regardless to this movement, slowly changing the status quo in the Temple Mount. Okay? But it is small changes that, like what says, okay, Jordanians have the custody over the Temple Mount, but we see small changes that create the atmosphere that we're having today in Israel and in Palestine, obviously. And I think that one of the main things that Israel should do before it will be too late is definitely stop this kind of movement. And I just want to say that if Israel would like to stop these movements, they can do it easily, much easier than many things that they can do. I hope it's...
Anyone else? Yes?
Hello, my name is Parvaza Chauhan, and I would like to move a little bit beyond, like outside of the city to the empty landscape. And Czechs are a nation of hikers. We like to walk in the nature. And I've been to this interesting lecture by a Palestinian lawyer, Reza Shehadi, something like that. And he wrote a book, Palestinian Walker, and he was talking about the landscape that used to be opened and used to be traditionally walked by the Palestinians, but nowadays it's been so, there's a lot of barriers. So if you actually want to spend a day hiking, you are constantly running into like a, I don't know, army or Israeli forces that just don't let you walk. And I would like to ask you, if you are just a Palestinian Arab living in the West Bank and you want to spend a day walking in the landscape, is it possible, or actually how possible is it? Can you walk like just around the place where we have seen the Arabs, remaining spots of the Arab settlements? So can you just walk within this, or is it somehow surrounded by fence, or is it surrounded by, I don't know, control from somewhere else? Or I would like to know about this.
I think, yeah, Ronnie, you probably know, can speak to the mechanics of the occupation and the security forces' presence in the West Bank. So maybe give it to you.
So just briefly about the situation, the control in the West Bank and so on. Everything is being controlled. Also, when we talk about settlements are not only about spots where, taking the land, it is also about the control of the land, of the resources, and to control the movement of the population. So basically, the issue of freedom of movement is critical, and especially so in the West Bank. It is usually, I mean, it could take, it really depends on the specific case, but it could take people hours just to cross a very short distance, for children to go to school, for people to visit their families, let alone to go and find and hike, in the open areas. It could take sometimes a matter of hours. It is all a question of checkpoints and so on. But if you try to take, let's say, a service taxi to cross the West Bank, north to south, you will come across many checkpoints on the way. I mean, if you are lucky and you have the permits and all of that, it would be quite a big deal.
May I add something about it, if you don't mind? First of all, you have to understand that since Israel built a wall around East Jerusalem, so all the Palestinians in the West Bank cannot, unless they have permission, they cannot go to East Jerusalem, which means that's a huge thing. It's the question, okay, you can walk in the desert. If you like the desert, it's fine. I mean, I'm very fond of, but if you like to go to one of the most important monuments, you are blocked. To make the long short, there is definitely an attempt of the Israelis, especially the settlers organization in the West Bank, to control especially the historic monuments, and then sometimes it's been isolated from the Palestinians. By the way, we submitted a petition to court demanding the Palestinians to get in, and the court says yes, but eventually facts on ground is that it's difficult.
Just a little bit. Can I just finish your question? No, there was another thing, like I've heard or I've read that there are some sites in the landscape. Of course, you have important places where something happened in the past, and this activist, he said that the Israeli state is trying to rewrite the history, not just of the cities, but also of the landscapes. And the landscape without history, it's an empty landscape, because we tend to give meaning to landscape. That's why we are interested in it and we live in it. So, and he said that since 2000 or since thousands of years, there has been history of the people that used to live there for centuries. And now it's being like wiped away and it's being replaced by history that's been there for decades or more. So can you talk about this? Because it's, I think, closer also to your expertise.
Should I?
Yeah, you go ahead.
I mean, I can talk about it for a long time. I definitely agree. It's extremely interesting, and I think, again, it's my point of view, I think that eventually Israel trying in many ways to annex the Palestinian landscape. That's what I see very many times, like when you're walking in the West Bank. So most of the landscape that you see, it's thanks or because of the Palestinians who cultivate this land in the last few hundred years. That's definitely that we know. This is the olive trees, this is the terraces, and so on. There's attempt in many ways, which I don't think I have time now to talk about it, but there's definitely an attempt to come and say that this is our ancestors' landscape, this is how the landscape used to look like 2,000 years ago, and so on. I can give you, so this is part of the struggle. I think there's a struggle over the identity of the landscape. I'll say one thing about it. There's an almost unknown national park in East Jerusalem called Emek Tzurim. This national park was declared as a national park with no reason, only because it's kind of preserving the landscape of how Jerusalem suburbs used to look like 2,000 years ago. There are only a few problems with these national parks. Nobody knows how the landscape used to look like 2,000 years ago. There are all kinds of theories, and some people will say that they do know, and their PhD support that, but in general, it's not an exact science. And the second thing that when you go into this national park, you see that it's planted by dozens of olive trees, which are not from there originally, actually. So there is definitely a struggle over the landscape, yes. I hope I answered your question.
Good evening, everybody. And also I want to thank the organizers about this discussion, also our lecturers about lectures. I wanted to participate with one comment to this, because this is for me the second event about some lecturers from Israel, and they to comment the government policy in Israel, also in Palestine. I want to say that my name is Naim Salim. I am, you said that there is a very dilemma about identification, but I am a Palestinian living in Israel. I really wanted also to define for me for this discussion as Arab Israeli, and I want, like, because you deal with the subject of Jerusalem, and it is difficult to exclude this from all what's happening in the area, and also about the politics in Israel, inside Israel, and also in Palestine. And Mr. Barkan, the title of your lecture was Occupied to Jerusalem. And really it is occupation. And when you link these maps, it is starting. And I want to say what was the question, what we can do now. And really, we now living in very difficult situation in the Middle East. We cannot exclude ourselves what's going. And I really blame the Arab world and the Muslim world, and more not the Palestinians, but more the Arab leaders and the Muslim leaders. That when you said today that Israel said maybe you cancel this event, and you told that the action should be that we have to come and to participate and to do it. Yes, and I think with the actions of Israel in Jerusalem, should be other master plan. You told that there is master plan for Israel, for Jerusalem, and no other master plans for the Palestinians. And when I want to define myself as Arab Israeli, because really I search for peace. I am now 60 years old. The war of 1967 is happening when I was 10 years old. Yes. And you can imagine how people like me, that all my life searching for the peace and nothing. Really, we was in the decade of Rabin, we was literally close, but now we're far away. And I want to come to what's going inside Israel. What is going inside Israel, there is change in the community because the political map in Israel moved to the right. And now also I can call not Israel, we can discuss about, talk much about Israel as democratic country and is democratic. In my opinion, it is not democratic. But for the Jewish people, now it is dictator democracy, because 50 people are now like governing 50% of the people. And also we can, I think, if we want to look at the decade of Netanyahu. I think Israel in this time, like they don't know where to go. And that's what I thought. I am Arab Israeli. I am like Israel and Israeli. I ask Israel what you want, where you want to take us. And now Israel is celebrating what's going in the Middle East. And they can do what they want. But this is also changing. I am seeing this. I am really worried also for the Palestinians as my nation. Also the people in Israel that I am living with them, yes, that they taking us to catastrophe. That's and I think that what, and sometimes I say a lecture like you, and I am happy that in the first lecture was some people, and I am looking now the other places. I am happy for that. And really I was quite interested to come to this lecture and to see the people. But I think there is subject like this, it was made like conference, not lecture, maybe one day. But I wanted to see the Arab ambassadors coming here and people from all our countries to say Jerusalem is international. It is for all. That's what we do. But all Jerusalem for all, not only the Israelis and Palestinians. I think Jerusalem is for all the world, for Muslims, for Judaism, for Christians, for all. But what's going in the Holy Land, I'm very sorry. I am really, you can also share my sadness when I am going and visiting Jerusalem. The things are really crazy. It's unbelievable.
Thank you. I think you very effectively expressed the frustration of many Palestinians, during the course of the last half century that the occupation has been going on. And if I can just kind of hone your statement into a question about, where do we go from here? Last week, under the auspices of the Egyptian government, Hamas and Fatah reconciled. And I guess there's really no way to keep this conversation confined to archaeology in Jerusalem because it obviously implicates the entire broader national struggle. So I guess I would just like to ask our panelists if they think that this renewed reconciliation of Palestinian leadership can lead to progress, not only on Jerusalem, but in terms of moving a process towards some kind of comprehensive settlement forward. So would you like to begin, Ronnie, and then, or whoever wants to take this?
First of all, about definitions, I wrote occupied Jerusalem because I see the whole of Jerusalem as being occupied, not only East Jerusalem, and I can go into that if you want, but other than occupation, the main character that exists in Jerusalem specifically is that of annexation. And I alluded to that, but I didn't actually elaborate much about some of the things that I wanted to say, that annexation of Jerusalem is a test case for Israel for what they may plan for doing with the rest of Palestine, especially so with Area C. There are concrete plans to annex the rest of the West Bank, at least Area C, and you could look at Jerusalem as a test case for that annexation. So far, a relatively successful test case from the Israeli viewpoint. The other thing that we can look at is, if we look at the Temple Mount movement was mentioned, for example. Only a decade ago, those people of the Temple Mount movement were a fringe movement among Israeli society. They were looked at as crazies. Today, they have mainstreamed the discussion and they have become part of the mainstream discourse. There is even a member of Knesset, Yehuda Glick, who is among the leaders of that movement. The deputy foreign minister, Tzipi Chodoveli, says that her her dream is to see the Israeli flag waving on the Haram HaSharif and so on. This is what they are saying, and there is a whole cadre of ministers and so on who have that wish that goes along with the crazies who are regarded as less crazy from the Temple Mount. Now, what needs to happen for the future? You're right, the whole discourse is moving to the right, is moving to be more extreme. I would say it's not becoming more extreme, it's becoming more explicit. It was always there. Israel is the supremacist apartheid state from the get-go, from the beginning. It is from its very foundation. It is based on ethnic supremacist values. What is happening is that the liberal discourse is diminishing and the more extremist discourse is showing its face. And then the question is what will happen next? From the Palestinian perspective, not because as far as the Israeli parliamentarians go or the Israeli leaders go, we know more or less where they stand. From the Palestinian perspective, I would urge every representative to stick to the basic fundamental Palestinian rights and not to renounce those three fundamental rights that also the BDS campaign lays out very clearly, which are obviously ending of the occupation of 1967, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem people deserve to be free from that occupation, but also equality for those who are second-class citizens inside Israel, 48ers, Palestinian citizens of Israel, or as you called it, Arab Israelis. I don't know, I will not argue with your definition at the moment. And finally, the rights of the refugees, the rights of those who have been expelled from their homes in order to create that ethnic supremacist state. This is a fundamental demand. How do we reach that? By 1 state, 2 states, 5 states? That should be a secondary issue. First of all, we need to demand these rights. Then we can argue about the practicalities of how to implement it. I cannot, as a privileged Israeli Jew, who basically stands to benefit from that system, that privileges people like myself, I am not willing to accept that. Even if there were no Palestinians around, I would still work towards democratizing that place where I live. I would work towards ending that system of supremacy and demanding equality. And this is what we need to do, to demand equality, to demand the rights of all the people of that land, of all the sons and daughters of that land.
I think that first of all, I don't know where it goes, the agreement between the Hamas and the PA and so on. But I think it's first of all, I think this kind of an agreement is crucial to Gaza Strip in general, to the people who live in Gaza Strip, because in general, I think the Israelis don't see the Palestinians, okay? They don't see the Palestinians in general, but if we try to level it, so at least they do know that the Palestinians living in the West Bank, and then Gaza Strip is somewhere far away that doesn't belong to anyone, or it's kind of the far land, I think they think that maybe Australia is even closer in many ways. And I'm saying, obviously no, but I'm saying that, first of all, I think if this kind of agreement will hold between the PA and the Hamas, and Israel will understand that there is one government who is responsible to both places, I think, maybe I'm wrong, of course, but I think it will definitely help to prevent other aggressions acts from the Israeli side. I don't know how much. We're not talking now about the peace options, but something that in general, if we're talking about the current thing, again, we don't know where it goes. And I'm saying that because I think that for Israel, it's very convenient that there are different Palestinians. There are the Palestinians who live in Israel and having citizenship. There are the Palestinians who are living in East Jerusalem who are residents, and they are separated between, you can say, between Israel to the world. There are the Palestinians who are living in the West Bank, and there are the Palestinians who are living in Gaza Strip. So at least in this area, you have like 3 levels of Palestinians with different status. Okay, maybe the Gaza Strip and West Bank. Now, it's also more complicated because you have the Palestinians who are living in area A and B, and I don't want to go into it too much, but let's say that there are different levels, okay, of Palestinians. So for Israel, this is the way to control. So this is why I think that it's a very important step to have the understanding that at least the West Bank and Gaza Strip is one unit or one government or one people. Hopefully later on they also, I think that what should be done also with regards to East Jerusalem, because there's no Palestinian holding East Jerusalem, by the way. I mean, the Palestinian Authority have no power there. And there are no leaders. So that's what I think should happen eventually. So I think that's what I'm hoping to see. Regard to the future, I think that any solution should be a solution that the majority will accept. And I believe that the majority of the Israelis are not in a position to accept a one-state solution. I know less about the Palestinians, and again, I'm sitting here amongst Palestinians who know much better than me about what the Palestinians' opinions is in general, but I think that it will be much easier to reach a 2-state solution than a 1-state solution in general. That's how I see it.
There was a question, I think I saw one in the back before you, sir. Was there... Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, then. No, go ahead.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a very informative briefings on what's happening in Jerusalem. I'll be short and sweet. 2 questions. Where do you see Jerusalem 20 years from now, demographically? And actually, 3 questions. Second question is, how come there isn't much sympathy for the Palestinian cause, since things are quite clear the way you present them, legally, historically, culturally, religiously, archaeologically. Yet such repertoire doesn't get much traction in this part of the world, incredibly. And this is part of the world that has really, really suffered under oppression and under occupation. Yet there isn't so much sympathy. Israel is always portrayed in a much brighter light than the way you Israelis are portraying it. And the third question is the significance really of the archaeological discoveries. I don't see this. Maybe there are hard to justify, legalize, legitimize an occupation for some sort, but thinking of this is really dangerous. We have an island. I'm the ambassador of Kuwait, so I'm no Arabic ambassador, so we're here. We have an island in the Gulf, it's a Kuwaiti island, where Alexander the Great was there, 331 BC. That's about 2,350 years, more or less. And Macedonia never made claims on the island. There are still potteries and houses on those islands. And when you go to places like Spain, you'll find many Islamic archaeology places and historical places, and nobody makes claims anymore on Seville and Cordoba and Granada. So where do you go with this? Thank you.
Okay, so how about somebody take on the first question? I mean, it seems, you know, pretty clear that in Israel, in general, all politics is demographic. So this is actually a very important question. What does Jerusalem look like in 20 years, demographically?
I feel more comfortable to answer the last question.
Okay, then take the second question first.
Because I think it's crucial. First of all, thank you for your question. Thanks for all the questions, but thank you for the last question regards to and giving the example of Spain. Because you're right. I mean, if I don't know the Moroccans or the Muslim world will come tomorrow to Spain to say, hey, we have so many monuments there which is ours, so we would like to claim it back. It sounds ridiculous, almost as ridiculous if Italians will come to Israel to claim ownership because the Roman Empire controlled it. But according to my understanding, we have a conflict which the historic narrative is a crucial part of it. Unlike other conflicts, let's put it, but at least in our conflict, the question of belonging, the historic belonging, is something very crucial because for us, the Israelis, and I don't care now if it's true or not, but for us, the Israelis, we came back to our land. And the history plays an important role. The Bible also plays an important role. The Palestinians, they definitely come and say, we were here for hundreds of years, and it's our land as well. So the narrative here plays a role which is unique in this conflict because archaeological monuments, unfortunately, plays a role. By the way, if you go to Emek Sheveh Facebook page today, you see that we're discussing there, we're writing a post about a pool which is located in a village called El Khader, near Bethlehem, which is called the Solomon Pool. It has nothing to do with King Solomon. And some settlers come and say, this is our pool because it's a Jewish pool. Now, it's ridiculous because this pool was used as a pool for 2,000 years to store water. Or maybe more, maybe less. So I don't know how to explain it, but in the conflict, when we are dealing, and this is why it's very crucial in Jerusalem, the historic narrative and the archaeological monuments play a role. And each side, especially the Israeli side, try to emphasize the Israeli history and come and say, I know it sounds ridiculous, but to all the Israelis, saying that 2,000 years ago, Jewish people lived here, and this is why we have the rights, is what gives us justification. You can like it or not. I believe it's something that needs to be worked with and cannot be denied, and doesn't matter what you think or what the opinion or what the academic says. Okay, it's something that, I hope I explained that, but it's something very dominant in the conflict.
Do you want to take on the first one, Ronnie?
I mean, about demographics, I cannot project. There are some projections about the future of Jerusalem and so on, but frankly, I don't think we should be discussing the demographic discourse at all. I totally reject the question of how many of us versus how many of them. The question is about rights, not about how many of each group live there. So I think that any such discussion about demographics should be left aside, and we should discuss with the real issues, which are about people's rights. And about the role of archaeology, this goes hand in hand with the whole Israeli attempt to deny Palestinian culture and Palestinian identity. The very Israeli identity is based on denying Palestinian identity. Our existence there is, you know, Israel does not live alongside Palestine. It exists at the expense of, on top of Palestine. And in order to discuss a better future, we need to accept that all the people have just as valid identity and claim to the land, and on and on. And I think that partly the role of archaeology in Jerusalem is about that, is about maintaining a notion that there is not only, as I said several times, supremacy over the land and resources and so on, but also supremacy about the culture, the identity, the history. This is part of the whole story, and this is also something that we have to seriously challenge, because we know that there is a rich history to that place, and it doesn't belong to only a select group. It belongs to many, very many people.
Can I add something about the question, what's going to be in 20 years from now? Based on what I see since '67 until today, and I think maybe it's a mistake to answer this question, because I'm not going to give you an optimistic vision, but I think that if I see what's happening more and more with the international involvement in Jerusalem and also Israeli activities in Jerusalem, I'm quite pessimistic to the future of Jerusalem. That's in short.
Hello, I'm a Colombian student here in Prague, and I want to ask you about if you know what do you think are the international reactions about this UNESCO issue with East Jerusalem these days. Of course, the USA has left UNESCO, and I asking this particularly because in my country we have a proposition now in the Congress, in the Parliament, also to leave the UNESCO. So, do you think some other people, some other countries are planning to do this also, or do you think other countries are supporting Palestine in this particular case, or what do you think about this?
First of all, I wish for your country not to leave UNESCO, although I don't think that it will be smart for Colombia, based on my short knowledge about Colombia. I think it's very easy to blame the UN in general, because if you blame the UN, you blame no one. I mean, yeah, the UN is kind of an amorphic. By the way, I'll give you an example. After the last resolution regards to Jerusalem or Hebron, if I'm not mistaken, Israel invited the Swedish ambassador for discussion how dare Sweden support. They didn't invite the Russian ambassador, although Russia also supported, because, you know, there's difference between Russia and our borders and Sweden somewhere there. So eventually it's, or Canada. So eventually it's very easy to blame the UN or UNESCO, which is the agency of the UN. The world decided before World War II, after World War II definitely, the idea that we need a body, it will be international body, that the whole states are talking together in order to prevent clashes, war, and so on. Sometimes some people say it succeeded, some say it didn't succeed. If you want me to criticize UNESCO, I can do it from today until next week, okay? It's very simple to do that, and I can even defend my criticism. But eventually, the international bodies is something that the international community decided that they are needed. And then I think that most, except for the United States of America, that is now going to isolation, which is the right, they have enough power to that. I think that most of the states cannot allow themselves something like that. And I think that there's with all of these politics and things like that, there's a beauty in the understanding that historic monuments and historic sites can be recognized by the international community as unique, which means I have nothing to do with the Japanese culture or, I don't know, or other cultures, and I can appreciate and recognize that there are unique places there that has international values and so on. I can also criticize it, but I think it's unique. So I think it has an important, first of all, it has a beauty value. I think it also has an important value There was an article in Israel, in Haaretz newspaper, about the touristic value and things like that. But I think it has a value eventually, as much as it sounds, it has value to promote peace, because it brings you to the understanding that there used to be different cultures, there used to be different periods, different civilizations, people live differently, people behave differently, and I think it's something that is needed in the world. And it's not by mistake that states who withdrawing from this body are states that in their agenda, based on my knowledge, are trying to exclude the others from their society.
I think it's important to understand what is happening with the Israeli extreme response to the UNESCO decision on Jerusalem. Because basically UNESCO simply followed its protocol, and since they're monitoring what is happening there, since, as Yoni mentioned, Israel is doing things that are contradictory to what it is obligated to, then UNESCO was criticizing those specific actions by Israel. At the same time, they actually acknowledged the heritage of Jerusalem that is shared by all monotheistic religions and so on. Israel interpreted this very differently, saying that the UNESCO decision against Jerusalem claims that Israel has no rights and heritage and so on over Jerusalem, which is not at all something that was written in the UNESCO decision. But what that response from Israel shows is that Israel insists on having a unique absolute, exactly, thank you, absolute stand with regard to the heritage, with regard to everything that is represented by Jerusalem. And secondly, the very act by UNESCO that monitors its actions is obviously detrimental to what these actions are intended for. Israel needs to take these actions in order to further its expansionist approach, etc., and to drive away more Palestinians from the city, and so on and so on. So basically, this insistence on that only Israel can determine the story, basically, the narrative, is something that stands in opposition to everything that hopefully UNESCO stands for, stands in opposition to what we see as democratic values of multiculturalism and respect for the minorities and all of that. And we have to put that in that light, I think.
I think we have time for one more question.
Good evening. My name is Omar. Actually, I have two questions, if you allow me. One for Jonathan and one for Ronnie. So the first for Jonathan. Regarding the biblical narrative, with all the archaeological findings and the latest excavations and all the knowledge, including the works done by Israel Finkelstein in the 80s and 90s. So the whole archaeological body of knowledge nowadays, does that confirm the biblical narrative as we know it from the Bible, just as it is written in the Old Testament? This is the first question. And the second question for me, regarding BDS, lots of people think that the ultimate goal of the BDS, as it is proclaimed in their agenda, is the destruction of Israel. This view is shared by Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, among others. They are known as very renowned scholars who, for years and years, have advocated the Palestinian issue and were quite critical of the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians. However, when it comes to the BDS, they both are quite, I would say, fierce opponent of the measure. So what do you think about, or can you comment on their interpretation of the BDS agenda as being the ultimate destruction of Israel? I guess they specifically refer to one of the points, which is allowing the refugees, or granting the right of refugees to return, which ultimately, in their view, would cause the demographic problem and eventually will cause the destruction for Israel in their view. So if you can comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Two very tough, excellent questions. Why don't we start with you, Yoni?
Okay, actually, you're very right. I mean, there's a gap between, you can say, or difference between, archaeological evidence and what is written in the Bible is not always parallel, like we know. There are many questions about it. There's a lot of research about it. Actually, this research began before the Israeli researchers. It began in Germany. Now it's very popular in Denmark, actually, in the beginning of the 19th century even. It's true. I mean, archaeological excavation are not always proving the narrative that we know from the books. If it's the Bible or other books as well, by the way. It's also because eventually it's a different method, and we cannot prove that. That is fact. But I think I will go further with your question, because we're not going to talk now about archaeology, if we can prove the Exodus from Egypt 3,000 years ago or not. That's not what we care about. I think that what is interesting that this debate still exists. It still exists because some people come and say, we haven't dug enough, we haven't did enough excavation or whatsoever. And there are some, by the way, there are some strong bodies that are still trying to prove the Bible through archaeology. But I would like to say something else about that. It's the role that I understand the Bible plays in Israel-Palestine. Sometimes when I'm guiding groups, I'm saying in the 19th century, archaeologists came here to Israel. And then it was not Israel, okay? And they could call it Palestine. But I say, no, they came to the Holy Land. Because in their view, they came to the Holy Land. They came to the land of the Bible and began these excavations. And I'm thinking that until today, many people when coming, doesn't matter if they call it Israel or Palestine, in their view, they come into the Holy Land. And definitely Israelis, by the way. I mean, the land of the Bible. And what I want to say from all of that, even if archaeology can prove or disprove the Bible, I don't think it's relevant because the Bible is much stronger than the science, by the way. I think the Bible is much stronger than the science. We can argue about that. There are much more people who believe in the Bible, who will support the Bible and follow the Bible or learn about the Bible. And eventually, I'm saying that so much, I'm talking so much about the Bible because I think it's a factor to understand when you're talking about the conflict. How we, the Israelis, and I think the Western, see the land of Israel-Palestine through the Bible. And it doesn't matter what archaeology will prove, it's something strong in our mind. I hope I answer your question or so on, but I think it's a factor that have to be understood.
I'm sorry, but I think you didn't answer my question because, you said that the Bible is more important than the facts on the grounds, the archaeological facts. But, the thing is that the religious Israelis, especially the settlers in the West Bank, they use, this is their cornerstone, the foundation on which they build everything and on which they build their claim of the land. So if we just let them believe in the biblical narrative without giving them archaeological proof whether it is right or not, and by extension also for the whole world, then we just we live in the blind world and we don't solve anything. So if you just want to crown them in the biblical narrative, let's believe in the Bible and let's ignore the archaeological facts. This is not a solution. We kind of we play into their hands.
No,
if I understood you correctly,
we don't play into the hand at all, not at all, because what I meant to say is that there is no archaeologist, I believe, in the world that can find something that will change people's belief. Okay? Which means it doesn't matter if tomorrow I will give you proof that Exodus never happened from Egypt. We still go in Passover to celebrate this event. Okay? We still will be raised as Israelis who believing that God liberated us from Egypt. It doesn't matter if you don't find any archaeological evidence for that. The numbers of the believers might change, but no more the numbers of the people who sit here, and that's not a massive change. Wait, no, wait. Unfortunately, I must say, we talk about equality. We don't have here equality because I'm standing here and I have the right and you have only a right to ask one question, or two, or three, or four. And this is what I'm trying to say, not because I want to argue with you, I want to say that to solve the conflict in Israel-Palestine is to respect and to deal with these historic and religious feelings. It's not to fight them. It's not to fight the people who believe. If people believe that the temple was where the temple is, I don't think the strategy is to fight them, to say, no, we have a proof that the temple was not there. It's to respect their feelings and to find a solution that says, okay, but there are also others who have as strong feeling as you have to this place. There are also other monuments there. There are like mosques there. There are long history of other beliefs to this place. And it's not by saying we found an archaeological evidence that your belief is mistaken, because I don't think that lead us to a solution.
Yeah, I think the Bible can be marshaled for a lot of different political outcomes in favor of a lot of, I mean, Exodus itself was written in Babylonian exile 500 years after it was supposed to have taken place. Ronnie, maybe you want to help us finish tonight with this this question about what BDS actually wants. I mean, and I think a good place to start may be what is the meaning of this term, the destruction of Israel? And what role does that play in the debate about BDS?
Okay, so just carrying on from the previous discussion, many people would like us to think, Israel would like us to think that this is some sort of a religious conflict. For example, the whole issue of Jerusalem, they would very much like to frame this around a religious conflict. This is why they promote the whole discourse around the Temple Mount and so on. Others would like to frame it as a conflict of cultures and so on. But actually, the situation is far simpler than that. It is a brutal situation, but it is far easier to understand. And there are those who came over, usurped the land, drove away the indigenous people from their land, and there are those who to this day are struggling for their basic rights as the indigenous people who demand their basic freedoms and basic rights. And this is what the BDS campaign is about. It is basically, I would say that the BDS call is from July 2005. It is most probably the most representative call coming from Palestinian civil society, which is basically scattered all over the world in 3 domains: those who are second-class citizens inside Israel, those who are living under a harsh military occupation, the West Bank and Gaza, and those in the diaspora, which are the majority, by the way. And these 3 domains, which are also represented by all sorts of different civil society organizations, trade unions, women organizations, all political parties have acknowledged that, and so on, basically comes and demands 3 fundamental rights for the Palestinians: ending of that harsh, brutal occupation, military occupation. People deserve to be free from that occupation. Equality for those who are currently discriminated against, for those who are currently second-class citizens who are discriminated against by law and in practice. And finally, and most importantly, the rights of the refugees, those who have been expelled from their land, in order to create a Jewish majority by force, by driving away the people from their land. It sounds quite basic. I mean, it's quite, I don't think this is a radical approach. This is a very mainstream, actually, liberal approach. And now come certain people and say that, okay, we can possibly accept that the ending of that military occupation, we can possibly, given certain conditions, accept equality inside 48 or what is regarded as Israel, but return of the refugees, that is a no-no, that will be the destruction of Israel. What does that mean? When we talk about the previous case of apartheid in South Africa, the struggle against apartheid was done in order to end apartheid. It was not in order to and South Africa to destroy the state of South Africa. Similarly here, when we struggle for the basic rights of Palestinians, we're not there to destroy the current entity which is called Israel. We are there to democratize it. We are there to demand, to insist that all the rights of Palestinians will be respected. How will it be done? Be it by 1 state or 2 states or 5 states, that is secondary. But the rights of all the people of that land, and I know 18 million people, 6 million Israeli Jews and 12 million Palestinians, half of which are in the diaspora, the rights of all the people of that land have to be respected. If those who are currently in forced exile want to come back, it is their full right and it is a personal right. No Palestinian leader can simply renounce that right. This is a personal right. Now, and then you asked specifically about certain scholars, Finkelstein and Chomsky. Chomsky, by the way, changed his view recently, he expressed himself a little differently in support of cultural boycott, for example, and so on. But I would simply say, and I said it actually here in Prague a couple of years ago when I was asked about Chomsky, I'll say it briefly. I think that both Finkelstein and Chomsky tend to speak about everything other than the main issues concerning Israel-Palestine. They speak about everything other than the ethnic supremacist character of the State of Israel. They never question that. They don't accept it, by the way, and you can, if you read Chomsky, he is clear about where he stands on that matter, but it is not part of his political agenda. And what both Finkelstein and Chomsky say is that we have to abide by what the rest of the international community accepts. They accept ending of the occupation, they will accept equality, they will not accept the rights of the refugees at this point, so we should just let it go. And I don't accept that notion. I think people have rights, these are very basic rights, and like I said before, as far as I'm concerned, even simply as a privileged Israeli Jew, even if there were no Palestinians in that area, I would still demand the democratization of the State of Israel, and I would still demand the end of that supremacist character, with or without Palestinians around. Certainly, those who have been subjugated and oppressed for 7 decades now deserve their rights, and I think that since I come among the privileged group, it is certainly my duty to demand their rights and to not accept that my privilege comes at their expense.
Thank you very much. I would again like to thank Yoni Mizrahi and Rani Barkan for participating in this discussion, and the student organization Polis for organizing it, along with the Embassy of Palestine, and especially thank all of you for coming. This is a crucial issue defining the Middle East and the world today, and it's very gratifying to see so much interest in the discussion that we had tonight.
And thank you very much.